Hello everyone and welcome to Nebulous. I'm your host, Rebecca Weich, and my goal here is to engage in social discourse to create drastic paradigm shifts. And what that really means is I want people to be able to reevaluate their social norms, to take an inner look at themselves, and to question their perspective on the world. Today's topic is titled, Am I Racist? Or rather, Am I Prejudiced? Have you ever looked at a Muslim man and thought, man, I hope he doesn't blow up this plane? Or have you ever looked at a black man and thought, man, I hope he doesn't really rob me? What about a white man in a black trench coat? Or a white one? Have you ever thought, goodness, I really hope he doesn't shoot up this movie theater that we're in? Besides seeing those events on TV, have you ever thought about what makes those things come through your mind? What about these statements? Blacks have no dads. Whites are racist. Haitians are violent. Women can't catch. Teachers have no real lives. Canadians are nice. And Asians are smart. Have you ever thought about where those statements come from? And which one of those are prejudice? Which one of those are racist? And are they really just biased statements? Does that really make me a racist for thinking these statements or actually hearing them? To get to the bottom of the question, am I racist? We have to break that question down. Now, as an English teacher, it's one of my biggest things to students is to break down the prompt. Many of the kids don't even get the essay right because they didn't understand the question that was being asked. And when people ask themselves this question, am I racist? What is racism? The word gets thrown around a lot. Hey, that's racist, that's racist, that's racist. But do we really actually know what that means? Racism is the result of prejudice, bias, that leads to discrimination based off of someone's race. It's usually based off the thought that you think your race is better than one or another race is better than the other, but at its fundamental core, racism means to discriminate against someone based off of their race. Now, it's really important to differentiate between racism, prejudice, and bias. And it's super important because you must call a spade a spade. If we're trying to eradicate racism or really just get to understanding, we must understand what the word actually means. I was watching a conversation between these four pastors on the Victory Channel about the difference of unconscious bias and racism and prejudice and all of those terms that go together. And he brought up this analogy about rattlesnakes and garden snakes. If we are searching for the problem and we kill the garden snake thinking it was the rattlesnake, we feel like the problem has been fixed. But in actuality, the rattlesnake is still out here running amok, causing problems, and we've never actually solved it. So, to successfully eradicate racism or to even have a conversation about it, we must be on the same page when it comes to terms. If we're going to call that racist or that racist or that racist, we should really know what we're saying, right? That is what we'll be talking about today. What is racism, prejudice, and bias? Where do these things come from? Can we actually be colorblind? Is saying the N-word racist? And what can I do about racism? So first off, I just want to thank you for clicking on my video and being willing to analyze yourself and ask yourself those hard questions, especially about a topic such as racism. This conversation has been attempted many times. Books have been written about it, poems, songs, laws have been made about it. People have been tarred and feathered about this conversation. Internment camps have been created because of this conversation. Churches have been bombed. And so when we tackle a topic like this, it's very important that we understand what is at stake, where we have come from, and to have a vision on where we see ourselves going. Raise your hand if you're racist. No one's really going to raise their hand, right? It's kind of a funny question to ask at all, really. But what about prejudice and bias? Make a long story short, to help you out, yes, you are prejudiced. I'm prejudiced. We're all prejudiced. And that's because we are a result of our social conditioning. And if you are an American, laws society, and many things are at play that really help condition us to see the world that we do. Now, this conversation has been attempted many times. And you might ask yourself, what's going to make this conversation any difference? 3 reasons I believe that this conversation about race has tried and failed to produce positive dialogue is because, first of all, racism is not static. It comes up in a lot of different ways. And so we may try to name it one thing, but it's really actually operating on a larger level outside of our understanding. We're not educated enough. We're not really aware of what the definition of racism is or what the history in our country is about racism. Aside from those things, perspective is the key to having this conversation. When I think about this, I think about 2 artists who attempted to have this conversation through music. The music video, I'm Not Racist, and This Is America. One tried to paint the picture of what it really meant to be a black person in America and their responses to racism, and the other was an attempt to show the dialogue that happens every single day about racism. And while I do believe and I loved their attempt at this, I believe that it failed. That the public, no matter how amazing these videos were, they still didn't have the correct verbiage or the education or even the open heart to really have a conversation about this. One of the things that I noticed when I moved to the States is that America was not as diverse as it really claimed to be. America was not this melting pot, this very diverse place that they really do boast about. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Now, there are lots of different ethnicities and cultures and races and religions here in America, but they don't intermix in the way that you would think when someone says America is a melting pot. That makes me think of this one interview I was watching about this Blasian woman she's Japanese and black, and she's raised in Japan as a Japanese citizen. And in the video, she explains how she's been discriminated against because of her skin color, but she makes this very monumental statement that says Japanese people cannot understand a world they cannot see. And I believe that goes for just about everyone. It's very hard to engage in a conversation about something that you've never quite experienced yourself. And so when I say that perspective is missing from the conversation, it really closes in people's mind and limits their understanding of things that are not in their daily lives. Racism being one of them. I believe that I have perspective to be able to bring to this issue. I was not necessarily raised in America, and so the bias and prejudice and things that are ingrained in people as they get older did not apply to me per se. Now, I'm a black person. I was very educated about the historical context of what race meant in America, but I was not all the way aware of what it really meant to be black in America, and I had no idea that racism was as prevalent as it still is today. So when I showed up here, there were many things that I noticed for the very first time that were a bit odd to me. I first off noticed that America was not as diverse as they like to claim. I really thought that America was this melting pot and that we were all getting along very well. There was this Elysium of a place that all these different cultures and religions and ethnicities could all work together for a greater good. And while on paper it did seem that way, once I got here, there were many things that I noticed that were very contradictory to America's motto of being a melting pot and accepting other people. America was still very segregated. Until you went to the major cities, you could see some intermixing of cultures, but I realized America was not in major cities. America was not LA, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, any of these major places that when foreigners see America on paper or on the map or on TV, they picture America as LA or Atlanta or any of those major cities. They really do feel as though America is a place where everyone is intermixing and getting along very well. Now, to a certain extent, that is true, but on a very deeper note, that's not true at all. America was more of a fondue pot than it was of a melting pot. It was very diverse. There was lots of different people here, but each different group of people had the privilege to be able to live in their own sectioned off part of America, whether it was Chinatown, whether it was the barrio with all Hispanic people, whether it was the hood where black people live, whether it was an all white suburb. I had no idea that there were all black high schools, that there were all white high schools, that there could be an all Asian neighborhood or an all Hispanic neighborhood or an all black neighborhood. This idea that America was intermixed was not necessarily true. And I saw how when I went to college, I noticed that many people were very intolerant of those that did not look like them. Now, they weren't carrying crosses or wearing white hoods or anything like that, but it was prejudice and racism in another form. I noticed that America was very rural and that it had those rural perspectives to match. Take that for whatever you mean, but many people did not have many opportunities to interact with those who did not look like them. There were many different people here, but they rarely had the opportunity to come to a place where they could intermix. Now, aside from playing sports or things like that, many people did not have any interaction with those that were different than them, and specifically that were other races. Now, I road trip a lot. I've driven so many places across the United States, and everywhere I noticed it was open farmland. I thought New York would have mostly buildings and cities and things like that. And as I drove through, I noticed that, hey, there's actually a lot of farmland in New York. I believe that is what equipped me to be able to have the perspective that I did, is that I'm a third culture kid. I'm an American citizen, but spent most of my child rearing ages outside of the United States. And so as I experienced other cultures and other people and other nationalities, I knew that what the standard of what happened in America was not it. Once you get outside your own community, you'll be able to see the world through a whole different light, and issues will not seem the same way as they did before. As a third culture kid, it was kind of like a gift that I had, that because I had not been socially ingrained to view race the same way people here in America did, I had a kind of superpower of being able to analyze different racial situations and break down the problem and really explain it to people. Before we get into defining the terms, I want to give you a bit of advice when getting into the conversation. When I was a high school English teacher, I was also a diversity ambassador on the staff. And what that meant is I gave professional developments and trainings and conversations about race and microaggressions, implicit bias, all those different types of terms to help make our workplace a better, more diverse and unbiased place. And one of the norms that we had before starting our conversations was lean into discomfort. And what that means is talking about a very tough topic such as racism will lead you to feel a little bit weird and uncomfortable, maybe a little angry, a little resentful. There's a lot of different emotions that come up when trying to talk about something that is so attached to who we are. That as soon as you start to feel awkward or weird or any of those things, that you lean into the conversation, into that discomfort, instead of running away from the conversation and trying to separate yourself from what's being talked about. Ask yourself those hard questions of, am I part of the problem? Could I be part of the problem? And if I'm not, what could I really do to help this problem? Because it is a problem still. So what is bias and what is prejudice and what's the difference? There are two different definitions that I found while researching for this topic that describe bias. One is a preference based off of what you are used to. The second is a tendency, prejudice, or inclination towards or against someone or something. Now, biases don't have to always be negative. They could also be positive too. If you have a bias towards something, it means that you're in its favor. So I have a bias towards Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby. And that's because I'm a Christian. And so I have a preference based off of what I'm used to and my beliefs. Now, that may be kind of deep, but I could also have a bias towards healthy food or short hair or news sources, or that I might be more comfortable having a woman babysitter than I would a man. Now that might sound like discrimination, but we haven't gotten that far yet. So we've established that we are all biased. But what about racially biased? In the New York Times, there was an opinion article published titled Our Biased Brains, and it was written by a journalist named Nicholas Kristof. After reading this article, I learned that our brains are wired to categorize people by race within the first 1/5 second of seeing their face. Even when told to sort by gender, our brains still categorize people by race. He goes on in that article to cite another study about racial bias showing up early in babies. And in this study, there were black children and there were white children. The white children were shown faces of white people and black people, and same for the black children. What the study concluded is that the child chose whatever race that they were most comfortable with, their preference based off of what they were used to. Now, it also showed that a child had no preference whatsoever if it had been exposed to different faces. And so to me, that says two things. One, yes, we are all biased, racially biased to be specific, and that this is not something that's permanent, it can be changed. But our social conditioning and what we're used to sets the stage for this. That leads me to one of my very first points. You cannot be colorblind. Colorblindness is a myth. Now, while I do see where that idea comes from, and it's usually coming from very well-intentioned people, it does more harm than good. I understand that when people say that I am colorblind, it usually means, hey, I don't see race, I'm open to being friends with or dating or being around anyone regardless of the color of their skin. But what that is really saying is I am ignoring any type of discrimination that has happened and that is happening towards people in minority groups or those that are in oppressed groups that do usually happen to be minorities. So what is prejudice? The Oxford English Dictionary defines prejudice as a preconceived opinion about someone or something that is not based in actual fact, reason, or experience. Some prejudice are racial in nature and have racist outcomes, but not all prejudice do. Let me give you a few examples. Teenagers are reckless, black women are sassy, and white people don't season their food. Those prejudices may not seem as impactful, but let me give you a few examples of prejudice that could and did lead to racial discrimination. The Germans believed that the Jews were inferior to them, thus leading them to try and wipe them out. Just like here in America, that indigenous people and black people were seen as less than and inferior, and so they were also tried to be wiped out or permanently placed in a second class. So where do these prejudice and stereotypes come from? Two different things: our vision and our social conditioning. And what I mean by our vision is our worldview. Our perspectives are either made up by or limited by the experiences we have in this world. Each of us go through life experiencing the world in many different ways. And one of the words I think that sums this up is intersectionality. If you've ever been in one of my English classes, you know this word. But for those of you that haven't, it means that each of us have all these identifiers that make us up. Whether it's our race, our age, our gender, our religion, our educational background, our nationality, our ethnicity, and many other things. There's a lot of different identifiers that shape who we are. Where they all come in the middle makes up our complicated experience as we go through this world. And it's not the same for every single person. Let me give you an example. I'm a black woman. My mother is a black woman. She was born in the 60s and I was born in the 90s. So because of our age difference, it doesn't matter that we're both black women. We do have similar experiences, but we're also separated by different generations and different understandings of the way the world works. Another example, let's say that I'm a black woman and I've got a friend who's a white woman and we're the same age. Because we're both women, we do have similar experiences, but because I'm black and because she's white, there are very different ways that we will experience life. Last example, let's say that I'm a black woman, because I am, and I have a black brother, because I do. When we go out in the streets every single day, my experience will be very different to him, even though we share experiences based off of our race. But because of racism here in America, he might have to fear for his life a bit more when driving than I would. So no matter our race, religion, gender, any of these identifiers, we experience the world in very different ways. And that shapes our vision of the world and how we interact with those around us. So I mentioned before that I lived in Korea. And when I would run into Korean people or those who did not live and work on the base, it was a pretty interesting experience. Them meeting me and me meeting them, we both had preconceived ideas of each other that were based on information that we did not get from our own experience at that moment. So during Christmas break, when all the family would get together, we would go out to the club or we'd go out and experience things, we would run into, of course, local nationals because that's their home. And when they would run into us, we would get different kinds of responses at times. My brother, he's pretty tall and dark-skinned, and Korean people would approach him all the time and ask if he was a celebrity or if he was Denzel or if he played on the NFL team or something like that. And then I'd have to ask myself, where did they get those ideas from? Duh. Social conditioning and what they could see from their own perspective. They had gathered their own opinion of us and vice versa based off of what they knew, what they had never learned, or wrong information that had been taught to them from their social conditioning, what they saw on TV, what they read in books, or what they learned from other people. And if we were reduced to what people saw about us on TV, we would all be in a very bad spot. So if they've watched American TV, what might you see about black people? That we're criminals and thugs and baby mamas. Or if you turn on the Housewives, you may think that we're very ratchet women who don't get along, who don't speak proper English, any of those things. The whole point is, no matter how exaggerated those ideas are, we are all a result of them. And what people see is how they view us, and how they view us is how, in turn, they treat us. And those are the steps of how this all comes together. Let me give you a few other examples that might make this a little bit more real to you. In the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, written by Beverly Tatum, the dean of Spelman College in Atlanta, she talks about a study where children have shown racial bias and as young as 4 years old. In this study, they ask a whole bunch of 4-year-olds to draw a picture of a Native American. Now, after all their pictures were drawn and they took them up, what do you think that they saw? They all had very similar themes. Someone who looked barbaric, barely clothed, that had something violent on them, maybe a tomahawk or something to hurt you with. And what was gotten from this study is that even at a young age, children had an idea of the other. Where did they get this idea from? They said they got it from Peter Pan. And so though it was something as simple and supposedly innocent as a Disney movie, those ideas seep into our brains and change how we view others. If you were to ask that same group of children, what does Africa yes, the entire continent look like? They'll probably draw you some lions, tigers, bears, and some naked people, right? And why is that? Every time we turn on the TV, there's some commercial showing a destitute or very poor or someone in a very bad situation in the continent of Africa. So of course, if we're never taught about those things in school and every time we turn on the TV, that's what we see, that is what our image of African people will be reduced to. We talked about the things we learn in school or the information that we might not get, but what about the things that our family is teaching us? This social conditioning also comes from those around us who are teaching us what's right and wrong or even how to be. That reminds me of a story my mother told me. So my mom is from Alabama, the deep south. That's where I went to college. And she had an older brother. She has 16 siblings, by the way. But her oldest brother, my Uncle James, she told us a story that he told her when they were younger. And he was in the grocery store. He had a little cart. He was going through the store, minding his own business, trying to buy groceries. And there was a young child, no older than 3 or 4 years old, that called him a nigger. And they said it in a very long, drawn-out way, as in a way to antagonize him. Now, when she first told me that, of course it was said with a few giggles because of the tone of voice that the child said it in. But to me, that speaks volumes to just how early and how insidious racism or prejudice starts here in America. That a child could be influenced by an adult to say these things, and not even to say them, but to feel bold enough to say it to an adult and not fear any kind of consequence, or to even really just think that that was something that should be said. Children are soaking in everything that we do, and so it doesn't have to be intentionally taught. It could be picked up just by circumstance. So like I mentioned before, I was a high school English teacher for the last 4 years, and I taught at a very liberal school where we discussed race and racism and gender all of the time. And during one of the Socratic seminars where we were discussing race, my children, the students, they opened up to me and we started to explain the different prejudice we had, the stereotypes we had, and where they came from. And one of the students told me, yeah, hey, Miss White, my dad told me that I could never date a black woman unless she was light-skinned and was Christian. Or one of my students said, yeah, my dad said that I could date a black girl, but my sister was never allowed to date a black boy because they were violent and they hit their women. And so I'm wondering, well, dang, where did those things come from? I've never met a black man that's hit a woman before. Now, I do know those things happen in all races, but I had no idea that this was a thought that they had of us. Amongst many other things I found out from my students who were 98% Hispanic, as we learned each other and we grew respect for each other and I grew my culture in the classroom, there were a lot of things I learned about thoughts that they had towards us or even other groups of people that had been there ever since they were a child. Aside from the stereotypes and the things that we learned from school and from our own parents, there is another aspect of social conditioning that I believe has some of the most power in shaping our view of others and the prejudice that we have towards them. And that is representation. And representation means how different groups of people are represented in the media or books or essays or any type of information that's given out to others. And the power that representation has to either hurt or help the image of a group of people. And the reason why I think that this is one of the most impactful things is because these stories have the power to shape the way that people treat us. Another one of my favorite authors is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She wrote that book, We Should All Be Feminists, which you should read, by the way. Half of a Yellow Sun, Americana. She's amazing. Please go look at her work. But what I'm referring to today by her is a TED Talk that she has that is titled The Danger of a Single Story. If you've been in my class, you've already read it, we've talked about it, and share it with someone else, all right? One of my favorite quotes from that entire TED Talk is, if you show a people as one thing over and over again, that is what they will become. And to me, I believe that this really highlights the negative impact that a negative stereotype can have on the group of people. There's a small anecdote that she talks about in there where she is at a college campus on a tour talking about one of the books she has written. And in that book, there is a Nigerian man, because she is Nigerian, there's a Nigerian man that is abusing his wife. And one of the students responds to her and says, man, it's really terrible that Nigerian men are abusers. And so she turns the statement on its head by saying, I read a book called American Psycho, and it's really such a shame that white men in America are mass shooters. Now, while that story is kind of funny, it really highlights the impact that a stereotype or a story has on our view of other people. From that one book, that one story, someone had created an entire opinion or prejudice towards Nigerian men that they were abusers. And she talks about stereotypes and their role in the world, and she says that it's the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, it's that they are incomplete, and it makes one story the only story. Now, that statement there seems pretty straightforward, and it seems pretty much like common sense, really. But if you actually look at yourself and analyze yourself, you'll realize that you have a lot of single stories about groups of people. And not because you're a bad person, but because you've never had to interact with someone that has challenged that worldview or that perspective or that story that you have about a person, a place, or a thing. An example that's a little bit closer to home is the job that I work in now. So I won't go into it, but I recently stopped being a teacher and I'm a nanny now. And I work for a Caucasian family in a pretty affluent neighborhood. And the very first day at work, when I met the 3 children that I nanny, is I walked into the bedroom of the 3-year-old girl, and she had pictures everywhere of this little black girl all on her wall. Now, while it wasn't weird to me to see a black girl, of course, it was really interesting to me that where I was, these were the images that I saw sprawled everywhere across the house. And that highlights the importance of representation. The fact that this show, Doc McStuffins, if you've never watched it, it's amazing, by the way. I've watched a lot of it, don't judge me. But to see someone as a positive thing immediately impacts how you view people that look like them. So when we go back to the study of the Native Americans and the 4-year-olds trying to grab a picture of them or draw a picture of them, that made me think back to the impact that Doc McStuffins is going to have on a whole new generation of children who before would never have seen a cartoon that portrayed a little black girl as a doctor, that her parents were a doctor, and that these were actually things that could be accomplished by people of that race. Now, another thing that we discussed that kind of supports these prejudice and keeps them alive is our social segregation. So the family does not live in a very diverse neighborhood. So much so that there are no black children. So I took the children to a park, and a little black boy pulls up on a scooter. And he comes over, he's being really friendly, really nice. He asks if we wanted to play. He's probably about 8 years old, and the kids I have are 5, 3, and 10 months. So initially, they kind of have a little bit of stranger danger and come closer to me when they see a new person that's showing up. But as we have the conversation, they see that I'm comfortable, so they naturally become comfortable. And as the conversation goes about, we talk about, I don't know, kids things. And at the end, the little boy that I nanny walked up to me and said, "Is that your brother?" And I thought that was super funny at the moment because I was a bit confused. One of, well, no, it's definitely not my brother. But it also brought to my mind of, man, He's never even seen another black person before. So his brain already connected the idea that there had to be some type of relation. It also makes me think about when we were watching TV one day, and if you've ever seen that movie Bringing Down the House, no, the kids were not watching it, but a commercial of it came on TV, and Queen Latifah is one of the main characters in there. She also plays a nanny, which is kind of funny, and the little girl, who's 3, looks at the TV and says, "Hey, is that you?" So once again, it's kind of funny to me, but it's a little unsettling at the same time that who I believe look very unique. I mean, not unique as in I'm special, but I know that it's not that hard to tell the difference between me and another black woman such as Queen Latifah, who's a few shades darker than me and has different hair in, and anyways, doesn't matter. We don't look alike. The fact that this child honestly felt as though we looked alike was a little bit alarming. When you grow up in areas that you do not have the opportunity to intermix with those that don't look like you, anytime you see an image of them on TV or in a book or a story that you've heard from someone, that shapes how we view them and how we interact with people that look just like them. Another story. When I first moved to Korea, my father was not living with us. Because he's in the military, it's very common that they'll send the military member to one place and the family to another place, and we just have to wait to come back together again. So with that being said, my mother is there. I've got 6 siblings. There's 7 of us kids. And so people in the community started making comments. Man, their dad is probably in jail or something. That's why he's not around. My dad's not in jail. He's never been to jail. He's not a bad person. He's not violent. None of those things. So once again, how did you come up with the whole opinion that my father was in jail because you didn't see him? You don't even know any black people, so where did that idea come from? Of course, if they've ever turned on the American TV or Hollywood, that image is plastered all over the TV all the time. So of course, millions of miles away in another country, you've got nothing else to compare it to. So, this black man must also be just some useless black man that doesn't take care of his children, right? That is the impact of social segregation, social conditioning, bias, and prejudice and stereotypes. It leads to assumptions that go unchallenged for forever. That makes me think about that movie, Into the Spider-Verse. I don't even know what the movie is about. I just saw lots of previews about it because a lot of commotion was brought up because it was one of the very first black people to play Spider-Man. Which, of course, there was a whole conversation behind that, too, of no, he can't be played by a black person because he's a white person. But that's a whole nother conversation. But the point of that story is, with a show like that a child could happen to see, that's the difference in them seeing the image of a black person as a superhero or as a positive image in a cartoon versus a thug or a lowlife or something like that from another show. Both representations of the same people, but in 2 different lights. Now, I'm gonna sum it all up. I feel like I've been talking for quite a while, and I still haven't even gotten to the main point of, are you a racist? And I'm not gonna go over that this week because there has been a lot that's been covered. We have gone over what is bias, what is prejudice, where do they come from, what's the difference between prejudice and racism, can you actually be colorblind, and where does prejudice come from? Next week, we will actually get into what is racism, what are the different types of racism, how does racism show itself in our society, what is systematic racism. We're going to be talking about all things racism next week. So make sure you come back, bring your friends this time so that we can really get to the bottom of, am I racist? See you next week.